Okay, let's get some music going in the background. Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 212, where I read and review philosophy live on air. And you can join me live and suggest papers for me to read. But otherwise, I just see what's on the front page of Phil Papers. So, here we go. I have some ideas for stream, so maybe I'll do some of switch things up. Well, not really switch things up. I'm gonna just add things. I'm gonna, for my other streams too, I'm gonna, I really need to start a Discord server so that people can talk to me, but that means what we'll do is, I'll also have a philosophy channel on the Discord server. And, that way people can suggest things, more generally, or more, even like not while I'm live, and then we can I can have like a list of things to read from that were suggested, like saved, and also things. So that would be interesting to have like some more social features like voting. Let's see, mind and language. Okay, they don't have page numbers on there. But okay, at least we have this. Oh, they must have had a issue on literalism. And this is 9 pages. So why I'm not a literalist. Okay, so we got something here from Mind and Language. Let's check that out. See what else we got. Against the Mind package of Mind's comments on Carrie Figdor's Pieces of Mind. This is like comments on that, but this is really short. Is this like a review? I don't know. Let's see what Zoe Drayson has written. Hey, it's here. I always like it. And so if it's here, 14 pages with a double spaced. All right, let's just see if this is if it's just like a review thing, that's no good. But if it's no, this is fine. So read this paper. Why I Am Not a Literalist in Mind and Language by Zoe Drayson. And I apologize for how I say everyone's names and everything else that is more difficult than very boring English. Like, unless your name's Bob, and I shouldn't even say that because I had a paper by a guy named Bob recently, or some other like Scott, and the problem was, of course, it was on French. A lot of French authors, and I can't read French, and it was terrible. I was constantly Hey Sirkin, reading some philosophy again. We're reading this paper called Why I Am Not a Literalist by Zoe Drayson. If you want the link to this webpage here where you can download the paper, it's in the chat, and anyone else who joins, you can always type !paper, and get the link will pop back up. So how you doing, Sirkin? What's up? Let me just load everything up. Exactly. I know nothing about it as well. It's going to be exciting. Or maybe not. I don't even know. We'll find out. Sometimes these things are good, and sometimes they're not. Or they're less good. I don't usually read garbage, but it has happened before. But sometimes they're less good. So this is Mind and Language is a nice journal, and hopefully this will be a nice paper. So I'm doing good. I got a bunch of stuff done. That's great. I did not get a bunch of stuff done. I basically sat around on other people's streams all day and did very little. But good on you. I got some things done. I started writing a new paper myself, and all the things I do basically take up a lot of time and thought. So I guess once I do one thing, I can't think anything else. So this is why I'm doing this. Drink something and read some silly philosophy. But let's go, as it were. It really be all... Yeah, well, that's been like most of quarantine. It'd be like that. Absolutely. But thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. So let's see what this is about. Semantics and the mind sciences. In the 1980s, when Fodor's Granny was being appalled by relativism in Harvard and graffiti in subway stations, I should probably know this reference. I don't know what Fodor's Granny is about, but he must have been referring to his grandma. That's Jerry Fodor, because I don't know of any other Fodors, but I apologize if it's not Jerry Fodor's grandma. Philosophers were appealing to cognitive science to settle questions about the semantics of psychological state ascriptions. The truth aptness of our folk psychological discourse, such as our ascriptions of beliefs and desires, was widely held to rest on the scientific posits of computational psychology. Yeah, I remember back then, people thought like science was just gonna like somehow our psychology was just gonna match up to the science, and then we just, hey, getting stabbed, what's up? Thanks for stopping by, reading some philosophy here. This is Why I'm Not a Literalist by Zoe Drayson. Just came out in Mind and Language this year. So, we're talking about folk psychology and science at the moment. But good to see you and welcome to the stream. So, yeah, they thought back in the day, which was like the 80s, back in the 80s, they thought basically our psychology was just going to fall to cognitive science and we just have computational psychology and things like that explain all of our thoughts. And they were wrong, but that's okay. The semantics and the science, yeah, and feel free to ask questions along the way. This is my first time reading it too, so. The semantics and the sciences of the mind have largely gone their separate ways over the intervening years. Some philosophers have drawn conclusions about mental states from semantic evidence while remaining neutral with respect to cognitive science, and other philosophers have used scientific evidence to justify claims about the nature of our minds while saying nothing about psychological state ascriptions. Yeah, so these two things did not match up in the after the 80s. They thought it would, and so people think like mental states from like the meaning of from meanings, and they don't talk about cognitive science at all, or some people talk about science, but they don't say anything about actually what it means for our psychology. So it's split apart. Carrie Figdor's book, Pieces of Mind, The Proper Domain of Psychological Predicates, is an attempt to reconcile the two approaches to the mind in a position she calls literalism, which argues for a semantic claim about psychological predicates on the basis of a scientific claim about the nature of psychological properties. Oh dear, really? That's what's going on? That's like hardcore. Good for her. Her semantic claim focuses on recent scientific work rather than everyday folk psychological discourse, which describes psychological terms to non-humans, such as cases where scientists describe plants as intelligent, bacteria as goal-directed, or neurons as having preferences. Figdor argues that we should understand such descriptions literally rather than figuratively. Her main argument for this semantic claim is the scientific claim that non-humans have been discovered to possess the psychological properties in question, and that these are the same psychological properties possessed by humans. Figdor summarizes literalism as follows. Hold up 1 second here. And yeah, feel free to ask questions, but I just want to point at something out right immediately. What does it mean that psychological properties are possessed by humans? I don't actually know. I know we have these things, we have psychologies, but what does it mean that we have, like, what does that actually entail? Like, what does that actually mean that we have these things? Like, I assume that we do, and what's the difference between our having them and animals having them, and is this actually so significant? I don't know. Like, there's no question that psychology matters, but exactly what is, like, how does it matter? Like, what does this do for us? Like, as soon as you start trying to like flesh this out, it gets real messy real quick. Alright, so what's literalism? Literalism holds that psychological predicates are being used with literal intent to pick out the same scientifically discovered structures across, hey Bubba Bloop, scientifically discovered structures across the relevant human and non-human domains. Okay, so this is basically saying that when we say something about humans, we have to say the same thing about like animals. So if like you say the dog is happy, just so you say the person is happy, it's not like you're using figurative happy when you're talking to the dog. You mean the exact same happy that you mean when you talk about a person. And that's the literalism. What's up? Alright, so Bubble, just so you know, we are talking about the difference between psychology and like cognitive science here. And like how do we understand when we say something about people and animals? What's the difference? So Figdor argues that we previously understood our psychological concepts in a human-centered way, and thus that the truth of literalism would demonstrate that our psychological concepts are undergoing radical conceptual change. Okay. Alright, so let's see what's going to happen in this paper. Continuing, and feel free to ask questions along the way. I will explore Figdor's scientific claim first before addressing its role in supporting her semantic claim. In section 2, I will evaluate Figdor's claim that quantitative scientific modeling provides strong evidence that non-humans possess the same kind of psychological properties as humans. Oh yeah, and by the way, Bubba Bloop, you should check out Getting Stabbed. Getting Stabbed is a streamer, and Getting Stabbed, you should check out Bubba Bloop. He also streams, so like, let's see if this actually works. And we got boom. So yeah, and Sirkin, if you ever stream, I'll shout you out, but you're just cool for being here, but you're not getting a shout out until you start streaming. Or do you stream? I've never seen any streams. Yeah. I apologize if Sirkin, you have started streaming. Or at least stream more and I haven't seen it. Alright, so I will explore Figdor's scientific claim first before addressing its role in supporting her semantic claim. In section 2, I will evaluate Figdor's claim that quantitative scientific modeling provides strong evidence that non-humans possess the same kind of psychological properties as humans. Figdor draws on 2 quantitative models to support her case. Her first case is a model of decision-making, which has been applied to both humans and to fruit flies. Her second case is a model of preferences, which has been applied to both humans and individual neurons. I'll focus on the decision-making case, but my arguments are equally relevant to the preference case. I will argue that Figdor neglects several important features of scientific modeling, which considerably weaken her scientific claim that humans and non-humans have the same psychological properties. In section 3, I propose that even if we accept her scientific claim, it does not provide the appropriate support for her semantic claim. Yeah, so this is going to be a big difference. The meaning is different from what the science is. Excuse me. As a result, we lack the evidence required to establish Figdor's claim that our psychological concepts are undergoing radical conceptual change. In section 4, I will conclude by raising some broader questions about an attempt to combine semantics and the mind sciences. Sirkin is all she usually streams on the guise of Pokimane. Wow. I did not know we had Pokimane in chat. That's amazing. I am so happy you're here, Pokimane. Figdor's scientific claim about psychological properties. Oh yeah, I want to make a comment here. Actually, no. I'll let it go. And I can't remember what I was thinking anyway, so it doesn't matter. It all just drifts. But please ask questions along the way. I'm trying to figure this out as I am going along as well. The drift diffusion model of decision making. Figdor's scientific claim is that psychological properties are not restricted to humans. She argues, for example, that fruit flies make decisions. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that sort of thing, and we're going to find out. She draws on the fact that scientists have successfully applied drift diffusion model of decision-making to both humans and fruit flies and take this to provide strong evidence that fruit flies have the same decision-making properties as humans. In this section, I will introduce Ddm, then highlight some important features of scientific models which Figdor neglects to consider. I will argue that if we take these features seriously, they diminish the evidence that Ddm is supposed to provide for non-human psychological properties. I conclude by considering and rejecting a counter-argument that Figdor could raise. Okay, I think I should say that I'm actually as far as these things go, I'm more anti-psychological than most. So it's I'm actually not so sure I care if Figdor is wrong. I may still agree with Figdor's point. She might be right, but for the wrong reasons. So we're just the same as animals, but not because of this scientific correlation. Anywho. In the simplest decision-making task studied by psychologists, subjects are given a forced choice between 2 options. I love this. This is hilarious. One such experiment involves a perceptual discrimination task where the subject is presented with 2 stimuli, for example, images, and asked to decide which one contains a certain target, for example, motion or a face. The subject's decision-making process involves accumulating evidence until they make their discriminative choice. As one would expect, there is a trade-off between response time and accuracy in such tasks. Subjects asked to make the decision quickly perform less accurately, and subjects asked to focus on accuracy will take longer to make their choice. When experimenters introduce noise into the stimuli by blurring or pixelating the image, the task becomes more difficult, subjects' response time increases, and their accuracy decreases. There are several ways to model these two alternative forced choice tasks, one of which is Ddm. The Ddm is a quantitative approach which models the process of evidence accumulation as a random walk through mathematical space, requiring and integrating evidence for two alternatives until a decision threshold is reached. The more difficult the task, the slower the rate of evidence accumulation, or drift. The Ddm models the formal relation between the drift rate and the rate of accurate and inaccurate responses. Okay, so basically, it's saying, okay, if they were guessing randomly, what's the comparison to a random guesser? Because that's what a random walk is. It's basically you're saying what would a random choice, like going through the options, do. So it's a random walk. Do you take left? Do you take right? Do you take left? Do you take right? So that's the concept of a random walk. And so basically, once you have more information, then you stop. The walk isn't random anymore. You're going left when you should go left. You're going right when you should go right. And so you can compare the what's going on. Okay. The Ddm was developed as a model of human decision-making, but has since been successfully used to predict the decision-making of behavior of monkeys and pigeons. More recently, Gupta and colleagues have applied Ddm to model the fruit flies. They first presented the fruit flies with a two-choice odor discrimination task and trained them to choose the more concentrated of the two samples. In subsequent trials, experimenters recorded the flies' behavior when right here. Flies' behavior. We're not talking about decisions, we're talking about behavior at this point. When presented with different combinations of odor concentration. The Ddm predicts that in more difficult tasks, when the two odor concentrations are more similar, the fruit fly's drift rate and accuracy rate would be lower. This is exactly what experimenters found. A group of flies with the FOXP mutant gene, which is associated with humans with motor and speech disorder, took more time to give similarly accurate responses than flies in the control group. So what you're looking at is you can't tell the flies have psychology, but you can measure their behavior. Now the funny part is, can you tell that humans have psychology based on their behavior? We say we do, but if we're going to use this test, it doesn't necessarily mean we have psychology, because you can only measure behavior with these sorts of tests. Continuing. Figder takes his data to show that the Ddm successfully models decision-making in fruit flies, just as it does in humans. She proposes that the successful uses of such models across humans and non-human domains provide quantitative evidence of structural commonality for specific capacities. In this case, evidence that human and non-humans share the same psychological capacity for decision-making. Figder's reasoning, however, relies on a number of assumptions about scientific models and their interpretation. In particular, it assumes that a certain representational relationship holds between the model and the world, which licenses our conclusions about properties of the world from properties of the model. While Figder acknowledges that there are philosophical questions concerning the representational and epistemic roles of scientific models, she proposes that these questions can be set aside for the purpose of her argument. In what follows, I will argue that answers to these questions have crucial implications for Figder's argument. Yeah, there's a huge amount of things when you do a scientific model. You're inherently making things simpler. That's the whole point of a model. The only accurate model of the world is the actual world. Everything that is not the actual world is a simplification in some sense of the rest of the world. So the question is it a good simplification at that point? And the author here seems to say no. Figder is saying yes. So that's what's at stake here. Yeah. So, two features of scientific models. The epistemic constraint on scientific models. Scientific models are epistemic tools that allow us to learn about the world. Alright, so again, immediately. Epistemic tools. What the heck is an epistemic tool? I don't know. We'll see what this author says. Figder clearly thinks that we can learn about an aspect of the world, the psychological properties of fruit flies, for example, from applying a scientific model such as Ddm to the world. In order to play this role, the model must be a representation of the world. But mere representation is not sufficient to justify us in drawing conclusions about the world from the model. We might establish a representational relation by stipulation, for example, but this would not allow us to learn substantial information about the world from the model. To play this epistemic role, models must represent the world in a way that allows us to form hypotheses about their target systems. Various representational relations have been proposed to meet this epistemic constraint involving features such as similarity, isomorphism, or inferential role. If we want to use Ddm to draw conclusions about the psychological properties of humans or non-humans, the appropriate epistemic relation must exist between the model and the world. Given these considerations, it is not clear why Figdor thinks you can set aside questions about how models represent the world. I will come back to this shortly. I think there's a very long-winded way of saying basically the model has to be accurate to the world. The model actually has to represent what you want it to represent. If it doesn't, then, like was said here, you can do it by stipulation. You can say that it represents whatever you want it to represent, but that doesn't mean it will. So the whole point of a model is that it has to actually capture the part of the world that you want and then nothing else. Because if it does, then you're not talking about what you want to do. So, but that's like anything else. If you're gonna say this is how the world is, you can do it by stipulation, or you actually have to capture what's relevant to what you're talking about. So abstraction and idealization in scientific models. Where the appropriate epistemic relation holds between a model and the world, the model can act as a useful surrogate to the world. Sawyer says this? Okay. We can manipulate features of the model where it would be impossible or implausible to manipulate the corresponding features of the world. The model is easier to manipulate than the world, not that. This is already published. Sometimes I tell the authors, but this one's been out for a few months already, so it's too late. Hope they caught that before the thing got in print. The model is easier to manipulate than the world because models are abstractions from the world in the sense that they leave out some of the messy details of real-world phenomena. Different kinds of scientific models operate at different levels of abstraction. Qualitative models represent causal features of the world using causal features of the model. We could model the spatial relations between molecules of a liquid with the spatial relations between plastic balls, for example, while abstracting away from other features of the liquid. Quantitative models, on the other hand, abstract away from the causal relations completely by using formal relations between variables in a mathematical equation to represent the formal relations between aspects of the world. A quantitative model of a liquid could model the formal relation between its density and flow rate while abstracting away from the spatial relations between the liquid's molecules. Psychological models can either be qualitative or quantitative. The process of accumulating evidence in decision-making, for example, can be modeled as a complex causal mechanism in the brain or as a single variable such as drift rate. Okay, yeah, if you want to break stuff down in terms of qualitative and quantitative, that's fine. But I don't really know what you're getting. We'll see what the author is trying to get out of this distinction. But basically, yeah, you have to make an abstraction. And there's different ways to make abstractions, of course. Qualitative and quantitative is one fine way to do that sort of thing. So, yeah, and if I'm not clear, let me know. I'm sure I'm screwing something up. Okay, continuing. While all models ignore certain details of the world, some models represent the world in ways which are at odds with how the world actually is. Well, there's bad models, basically. Like, if I say, Donald Trump isn't president, that's just not true. But, if I had a model where he wasn't president, it might be useful for some things, but it's not accurate into the actual world in terms of, representing the U.S. presidency, because he is currently still the president. Some quantitative models of liquids, for example, don't just neglect their discrete molecular structure, but rather represent liquids as having a non-discrete structure. They build in the false assumption that density and velocity vary continuously at every point. These idealized models are useful in allowing us to model the large-scale behavior of a system more simply. Sure. More abstract or idealized models can often be applied outside their original domains. Quantitative models of fluid dynamics, for example, can be used to predict the flow of automobile traffic because the variation between flow rate and density in traffic exhibits the same formal relation as in liquids. Hey, Cinesemiotics, what's up? While this highlights an interesting relation between liquids and traffic at a certain level of abstraction, the successful extension of a model to a different domain does not justify in inferring that the new domain has similar ontological properties to the original domain. The application of the model from fluid dynamics to traffic does not allow us to conclude that traffic is actually liquid. So why should the application of the Ddm to fruit flies permit Figward to conclude that fruit flies are decision makers? Well, here's the question. Why does it not permit us to say that traffic is actually a liquid? Why are all liquids not like traffic? They might be. How do you define liquid at that point? The idea that you're modeling traffic with fluid dynamics is fine. Of course, and traffic, I know traffic is not a liquid in the physical sense, but if you're defining models in a certain way, you still get to pick and choose what properties you're looking at. And just because you do not get to conclude that traffic is actually liquid, it does not mean it does not have the properties of liquid. So the question is, why should the application permit Figward to conclude that fruit flies are decision makers? Well, why were you using this model at all? Maybe this is a good model, but I don't even know if this question is getting at the real underlying problem here. So we'll see. Having elucidated these features of scientific models, I will now return to Figdor's claims about decision-making in humans and non-humans on the basis of the DDM. Figdor proposes that the DDM represents decision-making properties when applied to humans, and that its application to certain non-human species is strong evidence that those species possess the same kind of decision-making properties. Her argument relies on establishing that the DDM can play the appropriate evidential role in the first place, and on demonstrating that the evidence it provides is strong enough to outweigh any counter-evidence. I have concerns about both these steps. This is the normal state of reading philosophy. I'm like, I have concerns about this. First, we can ask whether the DDM plays the same representational role when applied to humans and to non-humans. In virtue of what does the DDM represent decision-making in humans? Figdor does not discuss this matter and gives no indication of whether she takes this representation to play an epistemic role. Notice that it would seem strange to say that the DDM provides us with evidence that humans are decision makers. The DDM was developed as a quantitative model of decision making in humans on the pre-existing assumption that humans are decision makers. Yeah, it doesn't provide evidence of it, but that doesn't mean that the DDM isn't correlated with it or doesn't capture anything of it. So I don't know if this is the right question. It wasn't meant to provide evidence of humans being decision makers. It was meant to capture something of decision making. So is that a problem? I don't know. We might still learn about the features of human decision making from modeling it with the DDM, but I suggest that we do not learn from applying the DDM to humans that humans have the psychological property of being decision makers. See, that's exactly the problem. We do not learn from applying the DDM that humans have the psychological property of being decision makers. But what do we learn? We may learn the properties of having decision making. And if those are all the properties, then maybe that is what decision making is, if DDM captures enough of them. So, questions. By way of comparison, consider the representational relation between models and fluid dynamics and the property of liquids they represent. We might use the models to learn about certain properties of the liquids, but these models do not provide evidence that the liquids are fluid. Rather, it was our pre-existing assumption that the liquids are fluid which enabled us to develop models of fluid dynamics. I don't know, really? Did we assume that they were fluids, or were we just studying some interesting property of the world? We didn't have to assume that they were liquids. We were assuming that these things that acted in a certain way. We could have started with cars. We didn't start with cars, but we could have started with cars and then somehow discovered afterwards that it also applied to liquids. So fluid dynamics could have started with traffic simulations. It could have. Why not? It applies to that. And then you could have found out that liquids are actually traffic. And maybe that's what it would have showed us. But if that's even the case, then maybe, that'd be okay. Maybe that is okay. And anyway, please ask questions along the way if you want to ask questions, please do. Continuing. Now consider the relationship between DDM and fruit flies. If we accept that the behavior of fruit flies in forced choice tasks can be modeled by DDM, this indicates that the model represents properties of fruit flies. But this doesn't tell us that the epistemic constraint can be met. It doesn't tell us that we can learn about fruit flies. Let's see if I can reread this. It doesn't tell us that we can learn about fruit flies from the model, and a fortiori, it doesn't tell us what we can learn about fruit flies from the model. In particular, it doesn't tell us that the DDM provides evidence that flies are decision makers. Compare the application of fluid dynamic models to traffic. We can accept that the models represent properties of traffic, its rate of flow, for example, and we might learn that traffic density covaries with traffic flow without concluding that traffic has other liquid-like properties. We can accept that the application of quantitative models from one domain to the other provides strong evidence that the two domains have important similarities. I heard fruit flies and EDM, and it could actually be a useful mistake. You know, the funny part is that was what was going on in my head too. I've said DDM too many times, it just goes to EDM now. Okay, so important similarities while denying that all the properties of the original domain should be attributed to the new domain. So if Figdor wants to use the DDM as evidence that fruit flies have the same decision-making properties as humans, she needs to say more about the representational relationship between the DDM and both humans and non-humans. I mean, this is a fair conclusion here. Like, exactly what does the DDM capture, and what does it show about anything in terms of like its subject? These studies can only measure behavior. Like, that's what you're measuring in the fruit flies. You're not asking the fruit flies about how they feel about like their psychology, getting psychology reports. But the question is like, does DDM time flies like an hour, fruit flies like banana? Yeah. What was that from? I can't remember now. So the question is like, what do these scientific studies actually show? Well, they show the behavior, and if the DDM shows that the fruit flies behave in the same way that people do, then you have to assume that there is something behind that decision-making process, that decision-making behavior. And the question is that psychology, is it not? So the question that the author here is ending with is a good question, but I'm not buying this, like, the full argument here, because, exactly, Groucho Marx. Yeah, you'd have to be someone as smart as Groucho Marx to say something like that. Yeah, so the question is, well, why you are attributing psychology to people in the DDM either? And if you attribute it to psychology to people in the DDM when you're studying people with the DDM, then are you bringing in alternate assumptions there too? And if you're doing that, maybe it's not so bad to do it for fruit flies as well? I don't know. Probably not, but the author has a point here. I agree with the author's point there. Probably going to say that here now too. Continuing. Even if we were to accept Karl Marx would just take the banana and stab you with the arrow, I don't think Karl Marx was actually that violent. I don't know if Karl Marx, I mean, some of the later Marxists might have, but I don't know if Karl himself was. Even if we were to accept that the application of the DDM to fruit flies provides some evidence that fruit flies make decisions, we still face my second concern: why I think this evidence is sufficient to outweigh any evidence we have to the contrary. After all, the DDM is one model among a number of qualitative and quantitative models that we use to represent decision making. I don't know if, that's funny. I don't know the history of Marx himself. I don't know. You might be right. We have information processing models, for example, which represent the interactions between the cognitive components of decision making, formulating the decision problem, identifying the decision goal, compiling a set of available options from a long-term memory, opting for an appropriate strategy or decision rule, and using it to evaluate the options to make a selection. Okay. You see, this is where, like, my Wittgensteinian history comes in. Like, I'm like this rule following thing, like that can't be what we're doing, because if you have studied your Wittgenstein, you've read your Kripke, you've done a bunch of this stuff. This is one of the reasons why in the 80s these things split apart, is because you couldn't actually fit the rule modeling theories which are information processing models, to the meanings of things. It does not work as philosophical problems. So here's kind of like where these things are going. Was one of the problems which is behind all this stuff. And so the question is like, why can we use that evidence actually to serve against this argument here that Figdor wants to make? And I'm not sure you can, because that evidence does not tell us about it tells us you can't do certain things, and this sort of problem is one of the things you can't do, so you can't do this sort of thing and then use it against the claim. Granted, Figdor would still need to provide evidence supporting it, but I don't know if you can use the counter evidence against it either. Alright, I don't know if that made a whole lot of sense, but continuing. We also have neural models of decision making which represent how these information processes might be implemented in the brain, including models which represent activity in the lateral intraparietal cortex as correlating with choice making. These information processing and neural models of decision making have not been successfully applied to creatures such as fruit flies because they lack the relevant neural structures or reasoning skills. Don't these considerations count as evidence against the claim that fruit flies are decision makers? You see, this is the problem, is like, why would you think that this is the only way to do these things? There might be other ways. Like, if we ran into like intelligent aliens, I can guarantee you they're not going to have lateral intraparietal cortex. I mean, they just won't. Like, the chance of an alien having the exact same brain structure as us seems very small. So why would we think that that is the only way to think or have psychology? I mean, that would be guaranteeing that psychology is based in particular structures that happen to be found in humans and nowhere else in the universe. I'm sure there's some other way to implement this. Why wouldn't there be? And this is the rule following thing. You don't have to follow one rule. You can always follow some other rule. And that's just sort of the metaphysics behind this. So. And some I assume are good people. I don't know. Go find me the good people. Everyone on stream is good people. That's where the good people are at. By way of comparison, consider the fact that models from fluid dynamics can be applied to traffic. If we were tempted to take this as evidence that traffic is liquid, we would soon reconsider in the fact of counter evidence from other sources, including qualitative models of traffic. Figdor appears to acknowledge the role of counter evidence in the case of decision-making models. She allows that if we could apply the Ddm to an inanimate object such as a body of water, we could probably not conclude that the object was a decision maker. In such a case, she thinks that the model would still provide relevant scientific evidence that the body of water makes decisions, but we would have legitimate scientific reasons for denying this conclusion. He's from your state, bro. There's a lot of people from New York. I propose that Figdor's reasoning here should apply to her own case. We can accept the Ddm provides with some scientific evidence that flies make decisions, while thinking that we have legitimate scientific reasons not to endorse these interpretations. That's fair. What was I going to say about this? Oh, it's called the Boltzmann brain, and this is something from the philosophy of physics and philosophy of science. It says, look, the universe is really, really, really big. And somewhere in the universe, there's some physical area in space, really far away from here, that acts just like a human brain. It has all like the planets aligned, just like the neurons, and the physics of it, like all the physics, act just like neurons that we have in our brain. So the entire universe in that area could be like a human brain. And so that means, wouldn't the universe be thinking in that area? Like, that's kind of what this is. It's like, couldn't that a body of water be acting just the same way as a human brain? And then you could say, look, it's acting the same way as a human brain is, and therefore it is thinking. That little bit of water for that little bit of time was acting in the exact same dynamic way our brain was thinking. And wouldn't we conclude that it was a decision maker? Now, these are very hard arguments because it gets very complicated. What do you actually mean by all this stuff? But the idea that you could actually model a brain out of water is not crazy. Like, you could do that. Now, why would you do that is the question. That'd be a little nuts to do, but why can't you, aren't computers, they're basically just blocks of silicon. They're inanimate objects. They are, until you put some electricity in them, but there's electricity all over the place. And so this is kind of, I think, a little misleading here. It's that I agree with this author, and the Ddm provides us with some scientific evidence that flies make decisions, but while thinking that we have legitimate scientific reasons not to endorse these interpretations, why not? If we find intelligent life in a swirl of water, why would that be a bad thing? Why? And this goes to a panpsychism, that anything can be thinking at any given time. And I don't particularly like panpsychism, but this is a hard question. It's like, why can't we model a human brain out of a computer? Like, it seems like that's the way we're going anyway. So, okay. To summarize, I've questioned two key ideas that Figdore's scientific claim seems to rely upon. I've argued that Figdore needs to do more to show that the application of quantitative models to non-humans provide evidence of their decision-making properties, and that this evidence is not outweighed by counter-evidence. And I agree with the conclusion. I don't love these arguments, but the author, I think, is almost certainly right. So it's like, how much weight do you put on these? I mean, you can put more weight on these arguments than I do, but it seems clear that I haven't read Figdore's work, but if you can even raise these questions, it seems that Figdore has a problem. So, Figdore's defense of the scientific claim. The first of my problems concerns the nature of representational relationship between the Ddm and fruit flies. Figdore seems to think that Dasgupta et al.'s application of the Ddm to fruit flies demonstrates that an appropriate representational relation holds. She thinks that when a quantitative model is extended from one domain to another, the model will represent the same properties in both domains. Quote, there are clear reasons to think the construals of the same mathematical models used across domains are univocal, especially when taking into account the explicit intent on the part of modelers. It is not clear why we should accept this claim, and it is worth noting that the explicit intent of the modeler is not generally considered sufficient to fix the representational relation between a model and the world. The case in which this is most likely to work are cases where the representational relation is stipulated and thus unlikely to fulfill the epistemic constraint above. Now, I think this is the right way to go. So, it's like, why should this quote here, I think, is actually kind of damning. I mean, I can't see why anyone would accept this statement of Figdore's. I want to focus, however, on my second criticism of Figdore's argument, that she fails to take into account our counter-evidence to the claim that fruit flies make decisions. Figdore acknowledges that talk of fruit flies as decision makers may seem counterintuitive, but argues that the application of quantitative model from one domain to another provides evidence of important similarities between the two domains, whether or not intuition agrees. The counter-evidence to which I am appealing, however, does not come from intuition, but from other scientific models of decision-making, such as information processing models and neural models, which do not seem to apply to the case of fruit flies. Figdore seems to think that such models are based on anthropocentric intuitions. However, they will only apply to creatures that are qualitatively similar to humans. She argues that quantitative models like the Ddm provide much stronger evidence for psychological properties in non-humans because they rely on a well-respected scientific method for discovering similarities that is independent of qualitative similarity to the human case. Well, maybe this is what I was saying, that if you can go find intelligent behavior wherever it may be, that's cool, but you don't have to rely on finding brains that look exactly like human brains. In what sense are qualitative models of decision-making anthropocentric? Information processing models in cognitive psychology, in particular, are not even biocentric. They characterize psychological properties at a level of abstraction from the brain in terms of computational states that can be implemented in different physical substrates. Whoa, 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 whoa. psychological properties are computational states? I mean, of course you can, but is that like the only way of doing it? I mean, assuming things are computational states is one thing, but like, is that the only like who's characterified information processing models? Okay, so you can do it in information processing models as computational states, but like, is that the only way? All right, continuing. Sorry, God, that threw me for a loop there for a sec. The foundations of artificial intelligence are grounded in the idea that a non-biological system could have the same psychological properties as human. So if Figdor thinks that such models are anthropocentric, she must have something else in mind. She seems to think that qualitative models are anthropocentric in the sense that they are taking particular features of human psychology as the measure of psychological properties more generally. She proposes that when these models cannot be applied to non-humans, it is because they are using an ideal hyper-rational, baroquely complicated human cognizer as a standard for real psychological capacities. But if the claim is just that qualitative models of psychological properties were developed as models of human psychological properties, then the same allegation can be leveled at quantitative models. In the DDM, for example, the mathematical variable drift in the DDM is an abstraction from the causal process of evidence accrual represented by information processing models. If the information processing models of decision making are anthropocentric in taking human psychology as their starting point, then quantitative models like DDM seem to face the same charge. Perhaps, but it seems like, the DDM is one level of abstraction up. I think that might be a defense that Figdor could say. It's like, yeah, everything is based on our psychology because we're the only knowledge that we have. Like all knowledge is based off our knowledge because that's all we have. But if you can abstract away from like more and more of like the physical realities or our biological realities, then maybe you can say, well, some things are better because some get farther away from our biology. I'm not saying I buy that argument. I'm just saying that this doesn't seem like this isn't knockdown right here, and I doubt the author thinks it is. But it's just kind of interesting. It's like, where does anthropocentricity end? Like, what makes something anthropocentric and other things not anthropocentric? The author here is arguing that all of this stuff is anthropocentric, but I think that's a little excessive. But that's, yeah. Figdor obviously needs to do more work in being clear about this. Alright, so Figdor clearly thinks there is an important difference between qualitative and quantitative models, and that this difference allows quantitative models to avoid the anthropocentric bias of qualitative models. But such a difference could only reside in the formal nature of quantitative models, the fact that they rely on the mathematical relation between numerical variables rather than the causal relation between concrete properties. Quantitative models of psychological properties are arguably unbiased in the sense that they do not require us to think of psychological properties as human, but they also do not require us to think of psychological properties as physically implemented or causally efficacious. Note that this makes quantitative models compatible with positions like dualism and epiphenomenalism, which sit uneasily with Figdor's naturalism. At the very least, Figdor owes us an account of the sense in which qualitative models built in an anthropocentrism that the quantitative models lack, and whether there's a sense in which quantitative models are specifically non-anthropocentric rather than more generally non-concrete, non-causal, or non-physical. I think this part's completely right. Semiotics asks, does this remind you of David Hume's explanation of causation as being a relationship between two events that are next to each other in causal concepts, but he seems to mean that not as a metaphor? I think he proposes as something approaching a definition. Causation is imputed when two events are contiguous in time in some kind of spatially arranged location that is next to each other, another event. It's like hard to grasp. Can you comment? Yeah, this is kind of exactly... Alright, so what's happening is you've got the structure here, and this is when you're talking about causation is imputed when two events are contiguous in time and spatially arranged. The time and space is exactly what's going on here. That is what is the quantitative model, not the qualitative. That's the quantity, and that's exactly kind of what's going on here. Hume had a pinball version of the universe, and so it's like the structure of things and the laws of nature. Once you understand the arrangement, then you know what the behavior of the universe is, and that's exactly kind of where you're getting here. The stuff Figdor wants to apply is behavioral. You're just seeing how things make decisions, turn left or turn right at different options, and that is supposed to get away from any sort of inherent psychology, which would be part of like the molecule or stuff like that. But he makes the same claim about mental causation, didn't he? I think so. It's hard for me to like recall my hume at the moment, but I think that's exactly the thing. He was saying, look, you can't impute. You don't know what the causal stuff. You only have correlation a lot of times, and this is the basis of Hume's problem. So how do you actually show that something is causally there and not just a, well, he would say it's some regularity. So through regularity, you understand that certain things are causally related. That gets into a huge literature on Hume studies, which I have read papers on here before. But the whole point is exactly that. How do you actually know that there's something causal going on here when you are only looking at the structure? And that's a hard question. Correlation does not imply causation, and that's kind of the argument that the author here is saying is, look, this can only show a qualitative relationship between the fruit flies and humans, but not the quality of having a psychology. So he seems to be forced to locate an abstract thing into locations of some kind. Yeah, Hume definitely needs to put things into like a superstructure, and that's kind of like, you can think of that as a mathematical structure. And so this is kind of what's going on here, is that this makes quantitative models compatible with positions like dualism and epiphenomenalism. Dualism, of course, is there's a mind that also works with the body, so you've got two different kinds of substance, which is a non-naturalistic theory, because you have this sort of mind which somehow interacts with the body, and so it's a different causal structure because you've got now mind affecting the body as well as the physics of the biology and the physics of the body. And epiphenomenalism, for those who don't know, is that means you've got all the phenomena of like the regular phenomena, but then like the interactions of it produce even more phenomena that are over and above the regular phenomena. And so there's something like downward causation. So you have all the micro features of the brain doing stuff, and that's what causes stuff. But then like sort of like the whole thing then also affects the how you're thinking. And so that means that there's something else going on that isn't explained by just the microstructure or the physics. So, yeah. But we're getting to the end of this. But I think this is, yes, the origins of this stuff does go back to Hume. So how do you actually Figdor owes us an account of the sense in which qualitative models build in an anthropocentrism that quantitative models lack, and whether there's a sense in which quantitative models are specifically non-anthropocentric. So how can we actually, well, the real problem is, how do you pull any of these things apart or put them together, taking them apart, so that when one thing follows one rules and says, well, this has psychology, how do you say, well, this other stuff doesn't? So I don't like arguing for panpsychism. I don't. Okay, I have argued that there is no easy way to understand how qualitative models are anthropocentric in a way that quantitative models avoid. As a result, it is not clear why we should accept the quantitative evidence that fruit flies are decision makers and ignore the qualitative counter evidence. This leaves Figdor's scientific claim that humans and non-humans have the same psychological properties lacking justification. I think this is mostly right. So, yeah. Okay, continuing. And if anyone else out there besides cinesemiotics, including cinesemiotics, wants to ask questions, please continue to do so. So, Figdor's semantic claim about psychological predicates, quantitative models, and literalism. Figdor relies on her scientific claim that psychological properties are possessed far beyond the human to argue that we are justified in taking scientific attributions of psychological predicates to non-humans literally. Much of the time, her argument seems to be that the application of a quantitative psychological model to non-humans provides us with defeasible evidence that non-humans are decision makers. Sometimes, however, Figdor suggests that quantitative models are playing a reference-fixing role rather than an evidential one. Okay, that's interesting. She suggests that quantitative models are providing our psychological predicates with scientifically determined reference points. In the case of decision making, the reference class of the predicate decides is determined by all and only those domains that can be modeled by the Ddm. But this is a stipulative use of scientific modeling, akin to the claim that all and only those domains which can be modeled by fluid dynamics constitute the reference class of the term liquid, which is clearly distinct from an evidential use of scientific modeling. It is questionable whether the same scientific model can play both of these roles. Yeah, I completely agree with this last sign. But I mean, that you can stipulate that what counts as a liquid is only in all and only those things that obey fluid dynamics. And in that case, you could do that. It doesn't go along with our everyday understanding of liquid, but that's not really a problem in science. You can stipulate whatever you want. So it's just this is the question is if Figdor needs this as evidence, you can't use it by stipulation and then as evidence. Definitely can't do both of those. Continuing. Although I think Figdor could say much more about the philosophical properties of scientific models, I want to allow her claim to have established that our psychological predicates, like decides, can apply to non-humans such as fruit flies. What I want to question is Figdor's further conclusion that our psychological concepts are changing as a result. She claims that we have not merely discovered that the world includes more decision makers than we previously thought, but that our concept of decision making has changed its meaning. Yeah, I think the author here is correct. You can't do both. You can't use your model to say this is how the world is, and then also you can't say this is by stipulation, look, how the world, to show how the world is as evidence, and then also say that, well, by stipulation, then also it's how we're changing. Because it's either it's evidence that something out there in the world happened, which is like you're showing that like you didn't change your mind, you're applying it in new ways. But then if you're also saying, look, because we're applying it now, it's changed us, it's like, well, you can do one, you can do one or the other, but not both. So this is a confusion that would be good to clear up. All right, conceptual change. Figdor's literalism claims that if humans and non-humans have the same psychological properties, then our psychological predicates apply literally to both. She also proposes that our psychological predicates are undergoing radical conceptual change on the grounds that our previous psychological concepts were human-centered, and while our new psychological concepts are not human-centered. Scientifically driven referential revision can also result in a newly precise standard for a kind. Human-centered concepts and capacities are adjusted in light of the new evidence to make them not human-centered. The truth of literalism alone does not entail such claims about conceptual change. It is compatible with literalism to simply claim that a reference class for the psychological predicate in question has expanded. Our predicates pick out properties which are more abundantly instantiated than we previously thought. Yeah, this basically says, look, we didn't think dogs had emotions before. Now dogs do have emotions. We have not changed our idea of what an emotion is. We just are including dogs in the reference class of things that have emotions. And that's fair. But I mean, that's what the author here says, not Figdor. Figdor proposes that we are undergoing major conceptual revision because our previous psychological concepts were human-specific, whereas our new psychological concepts apply equally to non-humans. She thinks that our previous psychological concepts were human-specific because she thinks that traditional approaches to the mind are exceptionalist. They take the view that human capacities are metaphysically exceptional. Figdor thinks that her scientific claim forces us to reject an exceptionalist metaphysics in favor of an anti-exceptionalist metaphysics, according to which psychological capacities are possessed by a far wider range of kinds of entities than are often assumed. This alteration in metaphysical views is responsible for the conceptual change, according to Figdor. I can find little evidence to support the idea that our traditional metaphysics of mind takes human psychological properties to be exceptional. Functionalism, for example, is notorious for allowing that octopodes, Martians, and even entire nations can be in the same psychological state as humans. Behaviorism identifies psychological states with behaviors or dispositions to behave, but with no restriction to human behavior. Even type identity theory doesn't restrict psychological states to humans. Pain in humans may be different physical states, may be different physical state type from pain in dolphins, but there is no claim that the human case is special or otherwise exceptional. I would like to suggest that Figdor's allegations of exceptionalism are best understood as allegations of metaphysical chauvinism, as discussed by Bloch. On Bloch's account, whether a metaphysical theory like functionalism is chauvinist is a matter of whether it withholds psychological properties from creatures or systems that do in fact have those psychological properties. This depends on how we specify the type of behavior, functional role, or brain state that is identical to each psychological state type. If we make a criterion for having a belief, for example, that one can articulate the content of one's belief, we might end up inaccurately withholding belief states from pre-linguistic infants and non-linguistic creatures. Similarly, if fruit flies are decision makers, but we can deny this because they don't meet our pre-existing metaphysical characterization of decision making, then we are guilty of chauvinism. This seems to be the same mistake Figdor refers to as exceptionalism. While I think that traditional approaches to the mind adopt an exceptionalist or chauvinist metaphysical view, this claim of Figdor seems to go unsupported, and without a reason to think our psychological concepts were previously human-centered, we lack the conditions for conceptual change. Figdor also fails to acknowledge Bloch's important point that if we reject metaphysical chauvinism, we run the risk of adopting metaphysical liberalism, ascribing psychological properties to creatures or systems which do not in fact have them. Yeah, and I think at this point I'm completely in agreement with the author. I didn't love the stuff at the beginning, but all this stuff here is, I think, dead on. And like I said earlier, I avoid the panpsychism, and it's like this is you do not want to ascribe psychological properties or creatures, psychological properties to creatures or systems which do not in fact have them, because this is at that point. This is when you start sounding crazy. Like you're like, oh, the tree's thinking. Well, the trees, I don't want to like discount what trees are doing, but you know what, like it's not thinking like we're thinking exactly, and you sound like an idiot when you say stuff like that. So you don't want to discount like the knowledge and like the evolution and like instinct and all sorts of things that different like living things have. But when you start to say like, well, I was saying earlier, is the like pool of water thinking, you sound like a moron if you're doing that, and you don't want to do that. It just feels wrong. So, I mean, the Boltzmann brain is meant to be a reductio ad absurdum. Like if you get yourself into the Boltzmann brain situation, that sort of means that you think anything can be thinking, the universe is thinking, and that's meant to be ridiculous. Now, panpsychism as having a resurgence, I'm not a panpsychist, so it's like I don't buy that sort of stuff. But, you know, there's smart people that do it. I just haven't found anything I like. So, and it doesn't seem that Figdor wants to be a panpsychist either. So, that's trouble. Conclusion. Figdor's attempt to combine the semantics of psychological predicates with scientific claims about psychological properties is an ambitious one. I began this paper by comparing it to the 1980s debate between realists and eliminativists over the status of folk psychology, and it is worth considering why that particular debate is no longer an active one. That debate relied on the assumption that there are direct connections between the claims about nature of the psychological properties and the truth or falsehood of our psychological predicate ascriptions. As de Brigard points out, that assumption is underwritten by a particular version of scientific realism. Once we acknowledge the alternative approaches we can take to the issue, there are no easy moves from claims about properties to claims about predicates and vice versa. The moves that are available to us are largely constrained by the sorts of things we want to say about scientific models and their interpretation, precisely the kinds of issues that Figdor thinks can be set aside for the purposes of her project. I hope to have demonstrated here that the scientific and epistemic features of scientific modeling are essential to understanding the relation between psychological predicates and psychological properties. And that's it. So, do I have anything more to say? I think this is a nice paper, in terms of, this isn't like a super cleverly organized paper, and that's not a bad thing, this is just a good thing. It sort of just marches along in terms of, sort of groundedness to, like, in sort of like empirical stuff, and then into the more philosophical arguments. So you're starting from like what most people might consider the most grounded, maybe most easily accessible arguments, because you're talking about like science and what is going on in science and what are alternative scientific theories, and then they're moving to some of the more philosophical arguments towards the bottom. Now, I gravitate towards the philosophical arguments to begin with, and I don't buy the physical arguments, but that's just me. So, I mean, in terms of like writing strategy, this was sort of well organized in terms of a writing strategy. Most people are probably going to appreciate how the argument was sort of spelled out here. So, like, you start with the pretty straightforward qualitative, quantitative distinction, and then you spell out sort of the different ways that this fails, that Figdor has failed in terms of like science, and then moving on to no, not the defense of the scientific claim. Once you do science first, and then we're going to psychological predicates. I mean, this is again a much more abstract thing than the science. So, yeah, and then like conceptual change. So this is less grounded than the earlier stuff. So this was a well-organized paper and well-argued in that sense, that it had a good structural argument, good structure for laying out an argument, which is an important thing if you're trying to convince people of anything, that the argument structure is going to be something that people accept. Because you can have whatever argument structure you want, but if people don't like how you're laying out your argument, it's not going to be accepted. Okay. Author, I generally like the historical tidbit, but I didn't like this historical. I like people that pull in like a few things from here and there. I didn't love this one because, well, that's just me. I mean, how many people remember the 80s discussion between folk psychology and Fodor's granny? I mean, maybe this is fine. This might, because it's coming out in a article in this sort of stuff, and so, but like, this is like a cute anecdote, but how many people are really thinking about this anymore? I'm not sure. So it's like, it's nice, but yeah, it didn't work for me. Maybe I'm just too young. Anyone have any questions out there from the chat audience? Please let me know. Yeah, this does go back to Hume's problem, as correlation does not imply causation, and that in some sense is being spelled out here. The quantitative results do not imply the qualitative properties. So, okay, if no one else has anything else, what I might do, I mean, let's see, is Bubba Bloop streaming? Because like we can send people over there. Let me just check real quick what's going on in the rest of Twitch world. Not yet. Yeah, you're gonna. Well, all right. It's a little too early for you still. Okay. Like, see who else is online. Oh, you're streaming in like 20 minutes. Oh shucks. Okay. Yeah. It's what's it called? 1 a.m. my time. All right. You know what? I'm gonna call it right here then, and everyone should go. Yeah, philosophy takes way too long. So I'm gonna call the stream here, and everyone should go follow Bubba Bloop, assuming he gets his act together and is streaming when he's supposed to be streaming. But he always does. So he has an excellent stream. Everyone should check it out, and. Have a great night, and I'll be back probably. Actually, I'll probably do another. I may be streaming again during the day tomorrow, because what I'm normally doing tomorrow is not going to happen. So, oh, you're going to be another reading stream. Okay, so cool. So if anyone else is here for the reading, then you should head over to Bubba Bloop in like a few minutes. It'll be cool. Have a great night, folks, and thanks for stopping by.